Creating characters in the ImagCard role-playing game actually follows a very similar process to creating situations and worlds. What we start off with is creating a character's core thing, which we start off by drawing 5 of any type of card. So we'll grab a world, a things, an actions, let's add another thing, and maybe another world. And the important thing to remember about any character is that they are gauged to the world that they're in, which is to say that a good character fits in their world. So if you're working with maybe an office scenario or something, maybe a core thing might be an education that they got, or a degree or some sort of specialized training they have. If you're working with a superhero world, it might automatically just be a power that they have. But any good thing or core thing that a character has will be related to the world that they're in. It will be somehow fitting inside of their world. And that's a very important part of the balance of creating characters, and where the game master will often come in and telling players that they can or can't do something, or helping players to guide the development of their character. So the core thing is essentially the basis of your character. It's not equipment, unless somehow that equipment relates to their history, like maybe it's your great-grandfather's sword that you've taken to war, or something along those lines. So it can be an object, and it can be even training or a power, if that directly relates to what is at the core of your character, what drives them, what is bringing them to the adventure that you're in, what's bringing them to the setting that you're in, and why they do what they do. For instance, maybe for a pirate it might be his ship. That's an object that he owns, but it's also an object that pushes his life forward. Or maybe for a gunslinger it would be their 6-shooter or their ability to quick draw, and that might guide her entire life, what she does for a living, what she chooses to do with her time. So the core thing is essentially what is very, very important to the character. And you start by choosing up to 3 of the cards that you drew, but you can also discard one and draw another one if you don't feel too strongly about one. So right off the top of my head, I'm not feeling too strongly about this sofa, so I'm going to replace that with a different one. That is a world, and I don't have to replace it with another world, but I am actually going to choose to replace it with another world card. So what we have now is we have a sign, we have somebody talking, something along those lines. We have a sky, maybe it's a sunset, maybe it's a sunrise, kind of a cloudy horizon with a sun. We have a hatchet or an axe of some type, and a gun, pistol, 6-shooter. You can really interpret these however you need to in order to make your character work. So in this particular case, I think I'm actually going to make it a skill of sorts. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take the gun, this hatchet, and this street sign to say that this character grew up in a rough urban setting where it was sort of a ghetto of sorts, where it's just a lot of people crammed together who don't really want to be together. It's a lot of desperation. It's a lot of difficulty. So he became a master, he or she. We haven't really decided gender yet of this character, but they became a master of a kind of close combat with firearms technique. I'll name that later. Bing. But we'll go with that for right now, just as we're beginning to develop this character. We don't exactly know their flair yet, but we do know that the setting is a little more modern, a little more technological. So being able to use firearms and close combat weaponry in an urban setting kind of makes sense as their core. And this starts to give us some idea of the character. It doesn't sound like it might be what drives them, but the more we think about it, the more we build out this idea, and we end up with this concept of this character who is very much driven by their need to escape their situation. They live in this desperate situation, and that's what drives them forward. Very much like you might see scoundrel-type characters or roguish characters being driven by their bad situations in life to constantly be looking for new opportunities. So his core thing does kind of push that narrative forward, this idea of like what this character is. And we'll give it a name later. It's fine if you don't name it up front, but that'll be the core thing of this character, which is technically a skill. But it is also you get into their background a little bit. You get into their personality, who they are, where they came from, and where they're trying to go to. And we probably won't give them a weapon. We'll see what their things end up with. But we do have a thing called general things in the game, which is basically anything that your character can reasonably be expected to have, they do have, based on their core things, their group things, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But anything that you can expect them to have, they will have. So we just don't assign special abilities to those things. So for instance, right now we might say they definitely have a pistol, and they definitely have I don't know, maybe a hatchet isn't all that appropriate. Let's say, well, why not? Let's say they do have a hatchet, or maybe a knife. Really, whatever the player decides is the flair that they want to go with. So we'll just say up front that they have a ranged weapon, a firearm of some sort, one-handed, and a one-handed close range weapon of some sort. And that'll be their general things, but we just don't assign any special powers to those things. So it's just like a thing that they have so that they can use their core thing effectively. What we'll do next is we will develop their things. We'll start by just shuffling these cards back into their appropriate decks. That's a world. That was also a world. And we will put this actions card back. And to develop things, every character starts off with two things. And these are much more direct objects that they can use. These are often pieces of equipment. These are maybe it might be a contact that they know. It might be some sort of education they received. It's much more of a smaller scale thing that they received throughout their life. So what we do for this is we draw 5 cards. I'll go with 2 things cards. I always like to build my things using things cards as much as possible. I'll add a world card to kind of gauge it to the world, and I'll add some actions because those can often make it easier to decide what exactly the things do. And what we do first, we don't actually discard any cards on this. We'll build 2 things using these cards in a very special way. So we start by using up to 3 of these cards to build the first thing for the character. So it's a very easy one up front. Let's just use these. I'm going to use these 2 for starters to say that they have this jumping, running ability, basically some sort of parkour. And since this is a modern setting, I'll just call it that. They know parkour. And in fact, let's add these fists here to say that they do some sort of fighting parkour, some sort of Jackie Chan-esque running around, jumping off things, using your environment to your advantage during combat. Bing! So that's kind of their specialization. That's why they specialize in the close combat plus the range combat, because they do this sort of combat environmental urban parkour ability. And we'll just call that something along those lines, maybe urban parkour fighting style, something along those lines. And that'll be their first thing, and they can use this a lot along with their core thing to kind of maximize the versatility of the core thing that we already developed. So what we do next to create the second thing is that we can take up to all 3 of these. You can take as many of the cards that you used to make your first thing and discard them and replace them. So I'm actually going to keep the jumping guy, because who knows what that's going to come to, and I'm going to replace these 2 cards. So I'll put that back, and I'll put that one back. And you can draw these from anything you want. So since that's more of a technique, I'm going to go ahead and draw another thing and an additional world. Kind of try and push it a little bit more in the direction of an object as his final thing. And now using these cards, we choose again up to 3, and we determine the character's second thing that they'll be going into play with. So there's a lot to potentially work with here, but I think I'm going to keep this one very simple. Now we know that this world is technological, we know that it's maybe on the verge of sci-fi, and we know that there is some sort of like DNA manipulation happening. So just to give this character a little bit more versatility within their world, I'm going to use these glasses, and I think I'll add the spear to say that they have some special glasses of some sort of technological glasses that allow them to, with incredible accuracy, examine someone's DNA. Bing! Essentially, maybe they used to be, maybe they knew or even stole from somebody who actually was on the police force finding people with DNA keys. So they have these glasses that they've learned how to use to examine people's DNA to find their keys that allow you into the different city-states. So we have our second thing. This one's actually an object, and now we can move forward with finishing to develop this character. But now this character has a core thing, which is, more or less very much tells us what their personality is, where they're coming from, where they're trying to go to. They have a technique that they can use that sort of works along with their core thing. And they have a completely unrelated object that they can use that is gauged within their world, but doesn't necessarily relate back to their core thing. And that's kind of the great thing about this game, is that as you develop things, as you find things, and eventually as you develop precedences off your things, which is the primary way of characters developing over time, they don't always have to relate back to various bits and pieces of the character that you've already developed. They can branch off into new areas. They can be completely unrelated, but they always give your character more versatility and more options for how you can play them. So let's go ahead and put these back. And there is one more piece of characters that you develop after you've got their things and their core things, and that is their group thing. And the group thing is usually done after you've finished making all of the characters who are going to be playing together up front. And you can add more group things later, or as you change out characters for other characters. But a group thing is built very similar to the other ways. And a group thing tells you how characters are interacting with each other, why they're traveling together, why they're working together. And a lot of times a game master or the team themselves might come up with something, or if they can't think of anything, you can just draw some cards. So what you do with this, as usual, is you draw up to 5 cards. I'll do one of each of these, I'll throw in a second world, and I'll throw in one more world, because these often tend to be very situation-based. So we take up to 3 of these again, and we will develop a group thing, which is, it's used very similarly in gameplay to how core things and precedences are using, and that you use them to perform actions. But it is specifically related to how the characters interact with each other and why they're working together. So let's just keep this one very simple. Let's just say that all of these people are working together on this mission specifically for their own personal good. And we'll use this house and this flying person to say that they came from the same neighborhood. They all came from this very rough, rundown ghetto in this very rough city, and they are seeking for something more like Icarus, essentially. They are trying to reach greater heights in their lives. Bing! We could theoretically add in the throne here to say that they're reaching for extreme wealth or something, or we could add that in later. But for right now, I'm just going to use these 2 and say that that's the characters group thing. Let's just imagine that we've created a bunch of characters who are very similar to this one, who are all sort of these roguish characters with a miscellaneous collection of interesting abilities that generally relate back to this idea that they're all sort of more coming from a downtrodden situation than more of a high class situation. So we'll just use those 2, and now we have a group thing for this character, and also for several of the other characters that would be together, because the group things are created after you've created all the characters, and then you decide how they interact with each other, how they relate to each other. But alternatively, if you have characters that maybe fit better as joining the group for other reasons, you can use other reasons. Maybe you have a posh character, someone who's very high class, or maybe you have some kind of a police officer, somebody who actually their job was keeping people out of the city using these DNA keys. And they could be with the group for other reasons besides this. Maybe they didn't come from that same neighborhood. Maybe they're sympathetic to the neighborhood, or maybe they're down on their luck. Maybe the posh person is sort of a disgraced noble or something like that. You know, you can have group things that relate to each other but aren't the same for different characters who are working together for reasons that are different but related to the reasons that other characters are working together. And group things is probably the most shifty, the most soft of the things in the game, the least concrete. But it also often gives characters a really interesting way to interact with each other, because group things actually allow characters to use actions together in tandem and to build precedences, which are, a precedent is essentially the way that we add more functionality to a thing in the game. To build those precedences together in ways that they can work together, in ways which they can use multiple actions simultaneously in a round to do really interesting things together. And group things are basically the only way in the game that you can do that. So now we have a completed character, and what you do after this is you take all this information that you've developed and you write the character paragraph, which will describe the character, who they are, what they can do, and just give you a really basic script for how to play that character. Just give you some idea of who you are role playing. And next up at the end of this video, I'll just narrate what the group or what the paragraph is for this character. And in the next video, we will show how to use all of these things in order to perform actions. Okay, so this is the character we created. This is Gretchen City. That's not a real last name. That's just kind of the last name in this world of anyone who doesn't actually have a family name, because she was born and lives in a city. Profession is street mercenary, and her species, or in this particular case, I guess ethnicity would be most appropriate, is Atrangu keyed, which means that she is genetically keyed to the Atrangu city. She has the usual 3 wounds, 3 setbacks, and 3 blunders of any starting character in the base edition of ImagCard. And then we'll get into her things. So for starters, we used World Card 64, Things Card 2, and Things Card 41 to create her core thing, which is sort of a skill, but also kind of informs her character. She is an urban-born melee and firearms dual wielder. Growing up in the worst part of Atrangu, danger was a near constant companion from your earliest of days. Survival dictated that you learn the way of the gun and the way of the blade, and as a dedicated survivor, you took to this education readily. A pistol in one hand and a knife in the other, few could match your ability at combat, and even fewer ever escaped to fight alive. Her first thing is Parkour Fighting Style, which we made with card Actions 10, Actions 1, and World 13. More than dual wielding, your fighting style incorporates your environment and your significant agility into a dance of destruction as effective as it is mesmerizing. And her second thing is a genetic loop. A loop, I'm not quite sure on that pronunciation, but it is one of those jeweler's magnifiers tools. So we used card Things 25 and Things 49 to make that. A simple device stolen from a police officer you once worked with. The small circle of glass embedded with scanners, microcircuitry, and a database containing a wealth of fully sequenced genomes allows you to examine any living being's DNA. So we built up her things there, gave each one an easy to refer to name, and this character is pretty much ready to play. Then we followed that up by creating the character paragraph, which is a lot of information that just helps you play the character more readily. These don't really play into any particular mechanic, but they do help with role-playing a lot. So, abandoned and ignored, the southern outskirts where the river Trigon bends around the great skyscrapers and carries the runoff from the lives of the wealthy into the streets of the poor, was home to every possible violence. From the controlled hits of organized crime syndicates to the senseless attacks of those driven to the edge of sanity and beyond, to honor killings and blood feuds over nearly any perceived slight, to the feeble attempts of the police attempting to use cruelty as a means of law enforcement, to the kinds of predators that only nature can create. The streets were stained with hundreds of years of blood, and it was here that your life has been lived until now. At first you sought only to survive, to live to see another day as one of the city's thousands of forgotten orphans, but as time progressed and your skills in combat grew, so did your reputation. You've done jobs for everyone, from the Trangula and the Apon, the city's 2 largest organized crime families, to the police, to random businessmen looking for unscrupulous mercenaries to deal with their problems for them. They've all grown to respect you and to never ask more of you than you are willing to offer. You may not necessarily be at the top of your personal heap, but you're damn close, and few risk direct confrontation without a very good reason. So now we have a lot of information about the world we're building up, and the character paragraph can be a great place to do that, particularly in a brand new setting. It's a great place to add flavor to your world that you can build off of later as you play. And that's the kind of fun thing about the ImagCard role-playing game, is that almost any part of it can build up the world and can build up settings to make them more interesting as time goes by. So even a character's information can add a lot to the flavor of the world. Finally, we added this group thing, Seeking a Better Life, which we built using card A53 and card W18. Riches, wealth, power, these remain beyond even your ability to imagine, but still you seek for a better life and a permanent escape from the streets you were born in and the cycle of violence that they've trapped you in your entire life. So this is basically what the character is looking for by being involved in the adventure, but furthermore, it's what many of the characters are going to be looking for. Several of the characters can use this exact same group thing, or can build their own group things off of it, basically just explaining why they're working together. And then just for completion's sake, to build off of her core thing, we gave Gretchen a general thing of a pistol and a general thing of a tactical knife, just so continuity-wise, she has something to actually attack with. And the thing about general things is that you're often better off making them basic, making them kind of cruddy, so that the character has a reason to upgrade over time. So the pistol A simple, half-rusted, half-dented second-hand revolver. This thing has seriously seen better days. And the tactical knife, a basic knife from a military surplus store. It's both convenient and reliable for a variety of purposes. So we're already leaving it open a little bit for her to use it for more than just combat. Maybe she might cut a rope at some point or something. But general things can have precedences build off of them, which you can learn more about in the actual role-playing game. But a precedent is essentially how we build off of things, how we make them more interesting and more usable and overall more unique. But the thing you want to try and do as a game master is to limit the amount of precedences that a character can build off of a general thing, just because general things are kind of there, but they're not meant to be special. Eventually, ideally, Gretchen would get a better pistol, would get a better knife that she could use to upgrade with precedences and make it increasingly more interesting. She doesn't currently have any precedences on her character sheet, but we did give her some wealth. We gave her 1d6 worth of work days in Atrangu credits, which work days are a method of calculating wealth in the game that we use just to figure out, generally speaking, what a day of basic physical labor is worth in a world, and then extrapolate out the costs of everything else from there. So Atrangu credits, let's just say maybe it's 100 credits per day for basic labor. That's maybe the minimum wage. So in this case, you'd roll a d6 at the beginning of play and just see how many credits she started with. Maybe you'd roll a 4 and she'd get 400 Atrangu credits to spend as you play along, which is pretty reasonable for a general mercenary in this world. Because she'd kind of have an amount of money saved up, but she's probably living pretty close to the edge. And that's the character in a nutshell, and the character sheet in a nutshell. And from there, you can start playing this character right away. And you can actually find this character and information on the setting and the situation that we built in these videos on our website, creepyassassingames.com. You can find downloads for all of these samples that we've done, in addition to several more sample characters that you can play directly in this adventure if you want to.